Okay, hello. This lesson is about the explanations of why we have wrongful convictions. Okay, since 1989, over 329 inmates have been exonerated by DNA evidence. Okay. Most of these exonerations have resulted from the work of the Innocent Project and the Death Penalty Information Center. Based on all of these examples of people who have been convicted and now have been exonerated through DNA, now all 50 states allow for post-conviction appellate review based on actual innocence, but it has to be supported by DNA. So what that means is that typically you can't not appeal based on the fact that you're actually innocent. But if that appeal is backed by the fact that you tested for DNA and your DNA is exonerating you or showing that you were not present at the scene of the crime or it was not a match, then you can appeal based on the fact that you're innocent. The federal government has also enacted the Innocent Protection Act of 2004, which is very similar to what some of the states have done. It is estimated that up to 3% of convictions are wrongful. So that means that 3% of the time that someone's convicted of a crime, they didn't actually commit that crime. They were innocent. So while it's not as high as some people have thought it is, you know, when you're in that 3%, it can seem like it's quite high. Even though some states have passed this post-conviction appellate review, some states make it very difficult for those inmates who have been convicted to gain access to the DNA to even get to the post-conviction review help. So they just make it difficult for them to get that. You know, the prosecutor will continue to fight, just like in the documentary, The Trials of Daryl Hunt, where the prosecutor kept fighting and making it difficult for Daryl Hunt to get access to, and even told a lie to get access to the DNA so that it can be tested to exonerate him. Okay, so now let's look at why do wrongful convictions occur, okay? And there's several reasons. The number one reason that wrongful convictions occur is because of mistaken eyewitness identification. Eyewitness identification is not the best evidence to have in a case. And matter of fact, if that is the only evidence that you have to convict someone, it's really best to get a second or a corroborating piece of evidence before you just move forward with that case. And a lot of prosecutors will do so just because it's not the best evidence. And it is the leading cause. Like 72% of all wrongful convictions that have been found that the person has been exonerated, so they're wrongful. They've had bad eyewitness. There's been an eyewitness who said that was the person who did it, and then the DNA comes back and it wasn't the person who did it. It's especially difficult when you're talking about eyewitness accounts and they're trying to identify someone who is a different race. It's a little bit, it's still shaky, but it's a little bit better when you have a person trying to identify someone of the same race, but when you have a white person trying to identify a black person, it's not the best, or even having a black person trying to identify a white person. That's when it gets really shaky for those eyewitness testimonies. Okay, a second reason for why a wrongful convictions occur is improper forensic evidence. DNA is the gold standard. It has become the gold standard. So when you have DNA, you know, unless you have an identical twin, there's no one else that has the same DNA that you do. So it is the gold standard. And the testing methods and all of that have been approved and tried and true, providing that, you know, the particular lab and police follow the proper measures. Then the testing process is actually, you know, proven for court. However, other types of evidence such as hair and fiber, if you've taken forensic, then you know that hair and fiber is what they call characteristic type evidence. That means you can't use it for identification purposes. So you can look at hair and you can say that hair is you can tell what race the person comes. You can say what part of the body maybe the hair comes from. What you really can't do is say whose hair it is. You can say it's consistent with this person. You know, they would have similar hair, but you can't say that that is definitely their hair. Same thing with fiber. Whatever you fibers are things that come from your clothes, like threads that come from your clothes. When you bought your clothing, that was not the only piece of clothing that was in the store. So that means that it can't be identified to you. It can be identified to that garment, and maybe you have that garment, but once again, it is not as definitive as DNA. Um, and also, too, when you're looking at improper forensic evidence, you need to look at how was it handled? Was it collected properly? I know one of the things in the O.J. Simpson case, the one where he was accused of killing his wife, was that they didn't collect the evidence correctly, and so they were, swabbing two different areas for blood with the same swab, and that's not appropriate for evidence collection. You need a different swab for every location of blood, and so that's contamination. And then also just once you collect it and how you're handling it, another issue that came up in the O.J. Simpson case was that they drove around with evidence. They drove around to a whole nother different crime scene on the way to taking it to the lab. So that could have been cross-contamination. All right, so a third issue is false confessions. Now, this one right here is the one that sometimes is really hard for people to understand because, most of us are like, there's no way I'm going to confess to a crime that I didn't commit. But it's actually more common than you would think. And we even saw in our discussion that we had the week of April 16th to the 20th with DeMonte, where DeMonte confessed to a crime that he didn't commit that later he was exonerated for. But 27% of wrongful convictions that have been determined through DNA have a false confession where the person confessed to the crime. Police interrogations can be coercive, and this doesn't necessarily mean that somebody was beating them or doing anything illegal, but the interrogation tactics are designed to elicit a confession. So of course they're very coercive. A profile, or some things that about someone who may be likely to give a false confession is a low IQ. Especially someone who is maybe borderline or actually mentally retarded. They tend to be more childlike, and children tend to want to please. And so they tend to try to please the police by making a confession. Young, such as DeMonte, who was 14 when he made a confession. So a lot of young people are at a disadvantage, and they are likely to give a false confession when questioned by the police. Ignorant of the law. So this is somebody they just don't know, and they get themselves tripped up, and then in a way to get themselves out, they just confess. Being intoxicated or under the influence of something. Now, this is also kind of on the police, because if you know that someone is intoxicated or they are under the influence, then you should not be conducting an interrogation at that time. That could also come back on you as an illegal interrogation. And then, of course, just fear of harm. So just having the fear and letting it get to you and letting it get to your emotions, and just seeking a way out of it and making that confession. Unreliable informants is number 4. This could be jailhouse snitches who are known for being unreliable, because a lot of times these jailhouse snitches are coming to tell you that someone, or they overheard this, or someone told them this, but they're wanting to get something out of it. So they're not doing it just to be good Samaritans. They're doing it because they want to get time off their sentence, but they have an ulterior motive involved in why they're coming to tell you about the crime. 33.4% of the time when someone has been wrongfully convicted, there has been some sort of unreliable informant involved in that. And we also saw that in the trials of Daryl Hunt, where there were unreliable informants and bad eyewitnesses and all of this other stuff. Okay. Tunnel vision. Tunnel vision is a big issue, and this occurs when criminal justice personnel, particularly the police who are conducting their investigation, become so convinced that a suspect is guilty, but they ignore any other evidence to the contrary. So the investigation is only focused on things that support their belief. So instead of having a proper investigation that seeks the truth, you get the idea that your suspect is guilty. So instead of seeking the truth, you're seeking evidence to prove that they're guilty. And so when you get into that point, then you're ignoring other things that may come up that show that that person's not guilty. And instead of following those things to see if maybe you can find the right person, you ignore that, or you discount it, or you twist it around to make it fit the story that you've already written, and you keep on that same track of this person's guilty. And you also see that with the Daryl Hunt, where his DNA is not the DNA at the crime scene, and they're still holding on. Well, he had a partner now. Well, what was this partner? You didn't argue that in either one of the trials, but now he had a partner, and he was a lookout, and he was going through her purse while the partner was raping her. Maybe he wasn't the one who was raping her after all. So that's tunnel vision, where you just have to be absolutely, this person's guilty. In light of all other evidence saying that they're not, then they're guilty. Um, Inadequate defense. This is when there's a lack of adequate defense representation, and 80% of defendants have court-appointed attorneys. And so what that doesn't necessarily mean that just because your attorney is court-appointed, that your attorney is not going to be adequate. But it's, there's a lot of things that come into play, and we've already talked about that when we talked about sentencing. So a lot of things come into play, like what resources does your attorney have? The prosecution has unlimited resources because the state is footing the bill, the government's footing the bill. And then the police, that they don't have to pay for investigators because they have the police. And some district attorney's office also have their own detectives that are being paid by taxpayers. They don't have to pay for experts because the evidence is tested for them at the state crime lab, and that's something that the taxpayers are paying for. So if you want to have something to the contrary, if you want to hire a private detective to look for evidence to the contrary, then you have to pay for that person if you're the defense. If you want to hire an expert to talk about to go against what the state's expert says about DNA evidence or any other kind of evidence, that forensic evidence that may be there, then you have to pay for that person. You have to pay for that testing. And so there's just not, when you have a court appointed attorney, there's not money for those things because that attorney's given a very low amount, and you still have to pay for the attorney. So there's really no money for those things. And so even when they petition the court for the court to pay for those things, a lot of times they're turned down. So it kind of puts the attorney in a bad position. Do they not pay themselves so that they can put on a defense for their client? Or because once again, this is their livelihood, they got to pay their bills, or do they, what do they do? So those are the reasons that we have for wrongful convictions. I'll go over them one last time. We have mistaken eyewitness ID, improper forensic evidence, false confessions, unreliable informants, and tunnel vision. And then we also have inadequate defense. Okay, so please take the time to answer the questions from this lesson. It's still going.